Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where we're going to continue on our exciting story of the life of Joseph. And when we left him, he wasn't in such good shape last time, and he found himself back in prison. And if you'll remember, he was able to interpret a few dreams. There was a cupbearer and there was a baker. Each one of them had a dream, and Joseph was, maybe you could say, he discovered a new talent that maybe he didn't know he had, was this ability to interpret dreams. But we kind of left him, and he was, still in prison, and on one of the, I guess you could say, lower levels of his life. Although he did, even in prison, as you'll recall, he did have a measure of success. He was actually put in charge of the prison. So, I guess it depends on how you look at it. But as we said before, this, I think, was a time of preparation for Joseph. Now, we're going to end up looking at a few more dreams here. Now, this time, it's not going to come from anybody in the prison, but it's going to come from Pharaoh himself. So remember, we're in Egypt now. In Rome, you had Caesar. In England, you have a king. But in Egypt, you had a Pharaoh. So he was the head honcho. He was, the main guy, and the buck stopped there with him, totally in charge of everything. So he has this dream, and we're going to read about that. We're in chapter 41 now, where all this happens, in verse 2. And this is the dream that he had. It says, "Out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile, and stood besides those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up." So this is dream number 1. But we're not done yet, because he has another dream. And we read about that in starting in verse 5. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. So then he wakes up, and this was, I don't know about you, I have dreams, and sometimes I know that I had a dream, but I haven't got a clue what it was. And sometimes I remember, little parts of dreams, but they don't make a whole lot of sense. I really think that this was something extra special. And one of the reasons we know that is because he describes in great detail everything that he saw. And that, I don't think I can say that I've ever had that happen. And the other interesting thing was that there were 2 dreams, not just one. But you can see the similarities between them. I mean, it was like 2 dreams with one theme. And we're going to find out what that is in just a little bit. But his mind was troubled, and he made this known to everybody around him. I had this dream. I don't know what it meant. And at this point, our old friend, the cupbearer, who was supposed to he was supposed to speak on behalf of Joseph to Pharaoh, but he sort of forgot. And I can understand that, because you're back restored to your position. You don't necessarily want to bother Pharaoh with little favors. That's kind of a, not so much a good idea. But this is where his memory kicks in. That I think it was 2 years prior to this when Joseph had interpreted his dream. And now the occasion comes up where you have the Pharaoh himself, who needs to have somebody, explain to him what this dream is all about. And so he remembers it. He says there was this young Hebrew prisoner, and he told Pharaoh the whole story about how Joseph was able to interpret both of those dreams, the dream of the baker and his dream as well. So Pharaoh explains to everyone, and this is in verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, after he calls him to come interpret his dream, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And it's interesting, Joseph responded, I cannot do it. Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answers he desires. Now this tells us something about Joseph. And of course, one thing is that now he's out of prison. Maybe he's still not sure how long he's going to be out of prison, but at least he gets this chance to kind of clean himself up. It says they dressed him all in fine robes and took off his prison stripes. I don't know what they were wearing in prison, but they had to make him presentable to stand before Pharaoh. But the real interesting thing, he doesn't say, as a matter of fact, I am able to interpret dreams, and this is a special thing that only I can do. He doesn't say that. He says, no, I cannot. And I think there's a real lesson in that, because he gave God the credit. He said that there is a God who will be able to give you the answer to this dream. And I think that's a great lesson in perspective. I kind of got a kick out of thinking about the possibility of Noah going around rounding up all the kangaroos, and how funny that would have been. But he didn't have to do that. And he knew he couldn't do that. That was the part that God did. And if you'll remember, then God was the one that shut the door for Noah to keep him, safe inside the ark. So we are able to do certain things, a certain amount. But ultimately, God does all of the heavy lifting. So I think it's interesting that Joseph made that very clear to Pharaoh, that I cannot do this, but God can. So then Pharaoh repeats the dreams to Joseph, and talks about the cows and the grain, and how the 7 good cows, 7 bad cows, 7 good heads of grain, and the whole story. And then now this gives Joseph the opportunity to interpret the dream, and that's exactly what he does in verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up after are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain, scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. And it is interesting if you look into archaeology, and they actually kept pretty close records of, like, the River Nile. That was their major source of water. And they can look and see in the records that were kept, where the water levels would be up and down and up and down. So this was actually something that did happen occasionally in Egypt, in the Nile River. And I think this time, though, it was something that maybe was unprecedented, because we are talking about 7 whole years of abundance, and 7 whole years of famine. And 7 years of famine, maybe you can get by with 1 year of famine, but 7 years, I don't know if he hadn't had this dream interpreted, what would have happened to the Egyptian people and everybody in that surrounding area. It would have been a very serious situation. In verse 31, we read, the abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. So Joseph is just kind of, reinterpreting the dream and telling Pharaoh that, you've got to do something. This is a situation that demands action. And this is, if you just had one dream, but you had the same dream in two different versions, so you know that this is something that God is pretty serious about letting you know, and that this is a matter that is extremely important. So now what do? Pharaoh has all the information. He's had the dreams, he has them interpreted, and he knows now what is about to happen. And he comes up with a plan. Well, actually, I think Joseph sort of recommended that you've got to find somebody, now you've got the situation, you got to find somebody that's going to be able to manage all of this wealth of produce that's going to come in these 7 good years, and store it away in preparation for the bad years. We see this in nature. The Bible talks about the ants and how diligent they are, and they work all summer long to store up food, and then they put it down in their little nests in the holes, so that all winter long they have something to eat. And so this is something that Pharaoh was going to be obliged to do in order to save his country. Now, what does Pharaoh do next? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." Whoa, what a change in fortune. I mean, you go literally from being in prison with no hope. He probably figured the cupbearer forgot all about me after a couple of years. And then all of a sudden you wake up one morning and, "Joseph, get dressed and, clean yourself up. You're going to go appear before Pharaoh." And all of this happens. Of course, we know that God is behind this all. And that's why, as I was saying before, this is one of the most amazing stories in the Bible. But it reveals to us, it just reminds us about God's sovereignty and how he can work in the affairs of men. He can use people like Pharaoh and kings, and he does many times throughout the course of history to accomplish his purpose. So now, what happens with Joseph? I mean, this is really cool. All the perks of being the second in charge in Egypt, in addition to all of these perks, being able to ride all over Egypt in a chariot, probably like a Mercedes-Benz chariot, and having all the finest clothing and all the power and all the authority that he was given, and then to make things even better, I guess you could say, Pharaoh gives Joseph his daughter Asenath to become his wife. And during these 7 good years, Joseph is also blessed with 2 sons. One of them is called Manasseh, and one of them is named Ephraim. And these 2 sons are going to come into play when it comes, I guess you could say, in the next part of the story, because as they grow, they actually become part of the 12 tribes of Israel. We'll have to get into that and explain how that all comes about. But we see this transition in Joseph's life from prison to advisor to the Pharaoh, to marrying the Pharaoh's daughter, becoming his son-in-law, not just his advisor, but his son-in-law, and being blessed with these 2 children, all during the 7 years of abundance. Well, those years did come to an end, and eventually the plan, just like they planned, they were able to cash in on the foresight that they had in being able to store up all this grain. And we read about that in verse 56. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout Egypt, and all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. Talk about a good investment. And now you're in a situation where you have something that everybody else needs. Now, we can only speculate as to how much money Pharaoh might have made on this whole deal, or Egypt itself. Whether they charged people exorbitant prices, I don't know. They call that price gouging. We don't really know, but I really think the intent of this whole thing was to save the people, to save Egypt. But it says, and this was the last part of this chapter, the last verse, not just Egypt, but it says the whole world. And now this is going to be a factor in what happens next in our story. And just a little preview is eventually Joseph's brothers and his father get involved in this. And again, it's a kind of an amazing way that God juggles all of these things around to accomplish his sovereign plan and purpose. So what do we conclude? Well, first of all, there is a sovereign plan. And for Joseph, it involved, these ups and downs, just like we were noticing last week. But that he spends this time in prison, and that wasn't wasted time, because he got to learn something about the culture, maybe the language, but also he came to realize that how else would he have known that he had this gift of being able to interpret dreams? But I think also, when we think about how God blessed Joseph, when God blesses Joseph, it also, I guess you could say, like trickle-down economics. It also blesses the people around him. He was a blessing to Potiphar, in his first job there in Egypt. And because God blessed him, Potiphar was blessed. And now he becomes a blessing to all of Egypt, not because he feels like he's so powerful and he's so smart, but because he knows he's totally dependent upon God. And this blessing from God is like flowing through him and blessing all the people around him. He doesn't have an attitude of I'm lording it over everyone. He maintains in all of this a servant's heart. And isn't that what Jesus said about his kingdom? If you want to be great in God's kingdom, you must learn to be a servant of all. And maybe that's one of the greatest lessons that we can see in this story, something that we can apply to our own lives. When we think about the work that we're doing, whatever it might be, that we want to do the best job we possibly can so that we can be a blessing to other people, so that the blessings that God gives us overflow from our lives and touch the lives of other people. Well, this is really one of the best parts of this whole story of Joseph, I think. It's just amazing what happens here and how he is brought from such a low place, in a discouraging place, to such a high place. But, that's what God wants to do in all of our lives. He wants to bring us to a better place and give us opportunities to serve him and be a blessing to other people. Well, we're going to get into the next part of the story where, as I said, Joseph's family kind of gets involved in this whole storyline here. But if you want to find out what happens, well, you can read ahead and, read chapter 42 and then the following verses, or just join us again next time on Gen Z Bible Class.